Are you really going to spend Christmas here all by yourself? The question cut through the air like a cold gust of wind on a rainy summer night. Hannah Parker still held a dish towel, standing at the entrance of the massive room with her worn winter coat draped over one arm. Her long shift had ended. The other staff members had already gone home, and she was entirely ready to leave. But something inexplicable made her stop. Standing over by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the towering Manhattan penthouse was Edward Clark, the wealthiest and somehow the loneliest man she had ever known. With his back turned to her, dressed in an impeccable tailored suit and holding a crystal glass of expensive wine, he seemed more like a piece of the silent, cold furniture than a living, breathing person. Edward slowly swirled the wine in his glass, silently watching the vibrant reflection of the New York City lights dancing in the deep red liquid. "Apparently so," he replied without even bothering to turn around to face her, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or holiday cheer. "Is that a problem for you, Miss Parker?" Hannah raised her eyebrows, maintaining a remarkably firm and confident posture, despite the vast difference in their social standing. "It is not a problem for me, but it certainly seems like it is a massive problem for you," she stated plainly, refusing to back down. He finally turned around, his sharp, calculating gaze colliding instantly with her light, unbothered tone, clearly unaccustomed to such directness from anyone in his employ. "I do not need anyone's company to toast to the holiday," Edward stated dryly, taking another deliberate sip of his vintage wine. "I have absolutely everything I could possibly need right here." "Do you really have everything?" Hannah asked, looking around the cavernous, immaculate room. "Because honestly, the heavy silence in this place feels like it is swallowing you whole." Edward frowned deeply, caught completely off guard by her sheer audacity, as nobody ever spoke to him in that manner, neither his employees nor his ruthless business partners. Hannah took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of her modest shoulder bag, and spoke with simple, unfiltered sincerity. "I am heading home to have dinner with my family in Queens, which is not too far from here. If you want to come along, there is still plenty of time to make it." The silence that followed her invitation was almost suffocatingly uncomfortable. Edward raised a single eyebrow, completely unable to believe what he had just heard from his cleaning lady. "Are you actually inviting me to dinner?" "That is exactly what I am doing," she replied, giving a casual shrug of her shoulders, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Christmas is meant to be spent with living, breathing people, not with cold crystal glasses and empty, echoing rooms." Her response caught Edward completely by surprise, as nobody had ever offered him anything without expecting a massive favor in return, without hidden agendas or endless flattery, just a pure, human invitation. Still, he clung desperately to his habitual sarcasm, asking if she invited all her bosses to dinner, or just the ones who looked pathetic enough to need it. Her smile was incredibly warm, entirely devoid of any smugness, pity, or judgment. "Well, are you coming or not?" He took a deep breath, trying exceptionally hard to maintain his rigid composure and professional boundaries. "Miss Parker, I genuinely appreciate your kind gesture, but it is not really appropriate for us to socialize outside of working hours. And eating completely alone in a dining room the size of a football stadium is appropriate?" she responded, letting out a soft, melodic laugh that filled the quiet room. "Come on, Mr. Clark. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being a regular human being every once in a while." Her boldness threw him completely off balance, making him look down at his wine, realizing that everyone else out there was celebrating, while he had absolutely no one. "Dinner is at 8 o'clock in the evening, and we are having a massive, delicious roasted turkey with all the traditional trimmings," Hannah said, pulling her car keys from her coat pocket. "If you happen to change your mind, it is the yellow house on the corner of Elm Street in Astoria. You cannot possibly miss it, as it has a terribly crooked wreath hanging right on the front door." She offered a gentle wave and stepped into the private elevator, leaving her echoing words to settle into the vast, empty living room. Edward stood completely frozen in place, as the heavy metal doors slid shut, separating him from the only genuine warmth he had felt all day. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and the absolute silence of the penthouse began to mock him relentlessly. He sat down in his expensive leather armchair, took another slow sip of wine, and tried desperately to convince himself he was perfectly fine alone. But Hannah's smiling face and those bright, honest eyes kept returning to his thoughts. "Christmas is for being with people," he whispered to himself, feeling the crushing weight of his isolated existence pressing down on his chest. Exactly at 7:30 in the evening, he decisively set his glass down, grabbed his heavy winter coat, and headed straight for the underground garage. "This is complete madness," he muttered to himself as he started the engine of his luxury sports car, navigating through the heavy holiday traffic. The navigation system led him directly to a simple, working-class neighborhood in Queens, taking him further away from his world of luxury and closer to something real. When he parked his gleaming vehicle, he stared at the modest house with white curtains, a glowing paper tree in the window, and the muffled sound of children laughing joyously inside. He hesitated, feeling that a man of his stature did not belong in such a humble place, but his overwhelming curiosity eventually defeated his stubborn pride. He knocked on the wooden door, hearing quick footsteps before it swung open to reveal Hannah, wearing a colorful floral apron, her hair down, and a bright sparkle in her eyes that instantly disarmed him. "Mr. Clark," she said, her voice filled with genuine surprise and a wide, welcoming smile. "I knew you would not be able to resist my roasted turkey." "Come inside before you freeze," she insisted, pulling him into the chaotic, wonderful warmth of her home, where he finally realized how wrong he had been about being alone. The next morning, Edward woke up blinking in sheer confusion, trying desperately to remember exactly where he was and why the ceiling looked so incredibly unfamiliar. The worn sofa he was lying on was far too small for his tall frame, and there was a rich, comforting smell of brewing coffee that definitely did not come from his state-of-the-art Italian espresso machine. Then the vivid memories flooded back. He was in Hannah's living room, having spent the entire evening laughing, eating, and experiencing the kind of genuine warmth he had not felt in decades. "Good morning, Mr. Executive," Hannah called out cheerfully from the tiny kitchen, teasing him about surviving a long night on a couch meant for regular, everyday people. Edward chuckled, running a hand through his messy hair, admitting that while he survived, his back might seriously consider pressing legal charges against her furniture. "You slept like an absolute baby, and I distinctly heard you snoring loudly through the wall," she teased playfully, handing him a steaming mug while wearing a humorous apron covered in cartoon cats. "I absolutely do not snore," Edward replied, feigning deep offense, to which she laughed warmly and assured him it was a very aristocratic, dignified snore that suited a corporate mogul perfectly. She served him a generous slice of warm cinnamon cake, explaining that in her lively household, the Christmas celebration did not end magically at midnight, but continued straight through the morning with sweet treats. As they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, Edward found himself naturally opening up about his predictable, lonely life, a rare moment of vulnerability for the guarded billionaire. In return, Hannah shared her deep, persistent dream of opening a cozy neighborhood cafe, a simple place where people could gather, talk, and feel completely at home. She confessed her lingering fear of failing and having everyone say they told her so, a vulnerability that struck a deep chord within Edward's guarded heart, making him realize they shared similar fears of inadequacy. Their quiet, meaningful moment was abruptly shattered by the relentless ringing of Edward's mobile phone, displaying 17 missed calls from his frantic business partner, Gregory Carter. "The corporate world waits for absolutely no one," Edward sighed heavily, standing up reluctantly to leave, though he promised to seriously consider helping her with her ambitious cafe project. Returning to his towering glass office in Manhattan felt like stepping into a freezing icebox, especially when Gregory handed him a towering stack of disastrous reports regarding a failing corporate merger. The stark contrast between the warm, laughter-filled house in Queens and the cold, calculating environment of his boardroom made Edward question for the very first time if his vast empire was truly worth the isolation. Over the next 4 agonizing days, Edward sat rigidly behind his mahogany desk, completely unable to focus on his spreadsheets, his mind constantly drifting back to a tiny kitchen and a bright, infectious smile. Unable to shake the lingering memory of her warmth, Edward finally sent Hannah a text message, inviting her to a professional thank-you lunch at a location of her choosing, hoping to bridge the gap between their worlds. She agreed almost instantly, stipulating only that the restaurant must not be overly expensive, leading Edward to select a tasteful, mid-tier bistro in the heart of downtown that was nice but unpretentious. Hannah arrived right on time, wearing a simple white blouse, denim jeans, and a handmade fabric bag, standing out vibrantly against the dreary sea of monotonous gray business suits. She excitedly read the fancy menu, loudly comparing an expensive vintage wine to overpriced fermented grape juice, entirely unfazed by the wealthy patrons whispering at nearby tables. Edward watched her with absolute fascination, realizing that her complete lack of filters and social masks was the most refreshing thing he had encountered in his entire adult life. "You are truly unbelievable," he said, laughing heartily as she pointed her fork at him and proudly declared that she was a very good influence on his formerly arrogant personality. Just as the atmosphere between them reached a perfect, comfortable rhythm, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the air, instantly freezing the warm blood in Edward's veins. Victoria Anderson, his elegant and incredibly venomous former girlfriend, stood by their table, looking down at Hannah with an expression of calculated disgust and sheer disdain. "What a fascinating little charity project you have picked up this time, Edward," Victoria sneered, her cold eyes scanning Hannah's modest clothing as if she were examining a discarded piece of garbage on the sidewalk. Hannah felt her face flush with sudden heat, but she kept her chin held high, refusing to let this wealthy, bitter woman intimidate her in the middle of a crowded dining room. "Are you actually insinuating that I am just a temporary hobby to him?" Hannah asked, her voice remarkably steady but laced with a dangerous undertone that Victoria completely chose to ignore. Victoria laughed cruelly, leaning in to ask Hannah if she had any idea how much Edward made in a single year, or that he could likely purchase her entire apartment building with his pocket change. Edward immediately stood up to demand that Victoria leave them alone, but Hannah was much faster, pulling her modest wallet from her handmade bag and throwing a few crisp bills onto the table. "I have my own dignity, which is clearly something you know absolutely nothing about," Hannah stated fiercely, turning her blazing eyes toward Edward, who stood frozen in absolute shock. "Thank you for the professional lunch, Mr. Clark. It was incredibly enlightening," she said sarcastically, before turning on her heel and marching right out the front doors of the restaurant. Edward tried desperately to grab her arm to stop her, but she yanked it away forcefully, leaving him standing there completely helpless, while Victoria smiled with deep, malicious satisfaction. "Get completely out of my sight right now," Edward demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold whisper, realizing he had just lost the most genuine person he had ever met. 4 excruciatingly long days passed since the disastrous lunch, and Edward felt the heavy weight of his mistakes pressing down on him more with each passing hour. He had called her phone over a dozen times and sent countless sincere text messages, but every single attempt was met with complete, deafening silence. Unable to bear the agonizing distance any longer, Edward finally drove to her quiet neighborhood in the pouring rain, clutching a bouquet of white daisies that had gotten terribly crushed during the frantic journey. He stood on her front porch, completely soaked by the relentless downpour, refusing to seek shelter in his car, until she finally acknowledged his presence and opened the heavy wooden door. When Hannah finally cracked the door open, she was met with the pathetic sight of the billionaire standing in puddles, his expensive jacket ruined and his hair plastered to his forehead. "I am absolutely not letting you inside my house," she stated firmly, her arms crossed defensively, still deeply hurt that he had frozen, instead of defending her against Victoria's vicious verbal attack. Edward refused to move a single inch, insisting that he would stand in the freezing rain all night if that was what it took to prove how incredibly sorry he was. 15 agonizing minutes passed, the rain pouring down harder, until Hannah rolled her eyes, let out a deeply frustrated sigh, and finally pulled him inside before he caught a severe case of pneumonia. Inside the warm hallway, a shivering Edward offered her the ruined bouquet of daisies, apologizing profusely and explaining the deep-seated bitterness that fueled Victoria's cruel behavior. He confessed that he had never expected anyone to attack her so viciously, and that his hesitation was born of sheer shock, not a lack of respect for her immense worth. "I missed you terribly, Hannah," he admitted, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper, explaining that his life had felt completely empty and utterly meaningless since the moment she walked out of the restaurant. Hannah's defensive posture slowly melted away as she saw the raw honesty in his eyes, accepting the battered flowers and finally agreeing to forgive his foolish hesitation. Just as a tentative peace settled comfortably between them, Edward's mobile phone shattered the quiet moment, displaying an urgent call from his frantic partner, Gregory. Edward answered, only to hear the terrifying news that his domineering father, Graham Clark, had returned unexpectedly from his extended overseas trip and was currently wreaking havoc at the corporate headquarters. "He is completely furious," Gregory warned in a hushed tone, explaining that Victoria had maliciously called Graham to report Edward's highly inappropriate relationship with a member of the cleaning staff. Edward felt his stomach plummet to the floor, apologizing hastily to Hannah before rushing back into the stormy night, knowing a massive confrontation with his father was utterly inevitable. When Edward arrived at the towering glass headquarters, he found Graham sitting menacingly behind the grand mahogany desk, projecting an aura of absolute authority and deep disappointment. "I built this massive empire on discipline and pristine reputation," Graham began coldly, staring his son down, "and I will not allow you to jeopardize it by fraternizing with the hired help." Edward's blood boiled with intense anger, defending Hannah's character, intelligence, and immense worth, refusing to let his father speak about her as if she were a meaningless, disposable object. Graham remained completely unmoved, issuing a final, devastating ultimatum. Edward must cut all personal and professional ties with Hannah immediately, or lose his position, his inheritance, and his future in the company entirely. While Edward fought a losing battle in the boardroom, Chloe, the loyal corporate secretary, approached Hannah during her evening cleaning shift with a look of deep, profound sadness on her face. Chloe gently explained that Graham Clark had specifically requested to review Hannah's employment contract, hinting heavily that a termination was imminent and completely unavoidable. Hannah felt her entire world crumble, instantly realizing that she was the sacrificial lamb in a brutal corporate war, and that Edward's father would stop at nothing to eliminate her from their lives. Refusing to let Edward lose the legacy he had worked his entire life to build, Hannah made the most agonizing decision of her life, choosing to walk away to protect the man she cared for. She quietly packed up her modest cleaning supplies for the very last time, leaving the luxurious penthouse completely spotless, just as it had been on the day they first met. Before departing, she left a short, heartbreaking resignation letter on his desk, explaining that they came from entirely different worlds and that it was best to end things before anyone got seriously hurt. Edward found the letter hours later, the words feeling like sharp daggers in his chest, realizing he was entirely powerless to stop her from sacrificing herself for his ultimate benefit. As Hannah drove her old car out of the glowing city and back to Queens, a single, stubborn tear escaped her eye, mourning the beautiful, unexpected romance that had ended far too soon. 7 agonizing days dragged by, feeling more like 7 long years to Edward, who found himself merely existing in a dreary world completely devoid of color or joy. He went through the motions at the corporate office, attending high-stakes meetings and reviewing endless financial projections, but his mind remained entirely consumed by the lingering memory of Hannah's bright smile. The grand Manhattan penthouse felt more like a luxurious prison than a home, completely lacking the wonderful smell of cinnamon cake and the joyous sound of her unrestrained laughter echoing through the halls. Gregory noticed his partner's profound misery, attempting to distract him with new business acquisitions. But Edward realized that his vast corporate empire meant absolutely nothing if he had no one to share it with. Desperate to escape the suffocating silence of his apartment on a breezy Saturday afternoon, Edward drove his car aimlessly until he found himself wandering through a lively street fair in Queens. The vibrant atmosphere was filled with the delicious aroma of roasted nuts, cheerful local musicians playing upbeat tunes, and joyous families walking together, creating a beautiful scene of genuine community. As he strolled past the colorful vendor tents, his heart suddenly skipped a beat when he spotted a familiar, radiant face standing behind a small, decorated wooden table. It was Hannah, wearing a bright red apron with the words, "Sweet Home," embroidered on the front, happily selling small boxes of her famous homemade chocolate brownies to the passing neighborhood crowds. Edward approached the modest stall, completely ignoring the stunned expression that flashed across Hannah's face the moment she locked eyes with him. Without a single word of greeting, he pulled out his leather wallet and firmly announced that he wanted to purchase every single brownie she had left on her display table. Hannah crossed her arms defiantly, refusing to accept his money, arguing that she had nearly 60 brownies left and that nobody needed to buy that much chocolate in a single day. Edward leaned against the wooden table, flashing a charming, persistent smile, stating that he was incredibly hungry and absolutely refused to leave the street fair until she sold him her entire inventory. "Why are you doing this, Edward?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion, reminding him that his father had made it abundantly clear they were to stay far away from each other. Edward sighed deeply, looking directly into her beautiful eyes, and confessed that he no longer cared about his father's rigid rules, his corporate inheritance, or the judgment of high society. "I have spent the last week realizing that I am completely miserable without you," he said earnestly, admitting that he would gladly trade his entire fortune just to hear her laugh one more time. Hannah felt the high, protective walls around her heart begin to crumble, moved by his raw honesty and the undeniable vulnerability radiating from the usually composed billionaire. To prove his complete dedication, Edward invited her to attend the highly exclusive New Year's Eve charity gala as his official date, a highly publicized event where the entire city elite would be present. Hannah hesitated, terrified of being humiliated again by people like Victoria, pointing out that she did not have a fancy designer gown or the refined etiquette required for such a glamorous occasion. Edward gently reached across the table, taking her soft hand in his, promising that he would never let anyone disrespect her again, and that he wanted the whole world to know she was his partner. He insisted that she did not need a designer gown, because her natural beauty and genuine spirit were worth far more than any expensive piece of fabric money could ever buy. After a long, breathless moment of consideration, Hannah finally agreed to attend the gala, but on the strict condition that she would go entirely as herself, without any expensive makeovers or borrowed jewelry. Edward laughed with pure, unrestrained relief, happily agreeing to all her stubborn terms, feeling a massive weight lift off his weary shoulders for the first time in weeks. He grabbed the heavy boxes of brownies he had purchased, promising to pick her up at precisely 7 o'clock on the evening of the grand celebration, his heart soaring with newfound hope. As Edward drove away from the bustling street fair, Hannah watched his car disappear into the distance, feeling a sweet, lingering sense of excitement for the beautiful future they were finally brave enough to fight for. The highly anticipated New Year's Eve charity gala arrived, filling the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel with sparkling crystal chandeliers, elaborate floral arrangements, and an elegant classical orchestra. Edward stood near the grand entrance, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, anxiously waiting for Hannah to arrive, while Gregory teased him about looking more terrified than a rookie stockbroker on his first day. When Hannah finally walked through the grand double doors, the entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, captivated by her undeniable grace and natural, unforced beauty. She wore a stunning emerald green dress that she had meticulously sewn herself, completely devoid of heavy makeup or flashy diamonds, yet she effortlessly outshined every wealthy socialite in the massive room. Edward walked toward her, completely mesmerized, taking her hand and proudly leading her through the sea of whispering aristocrats, introducing her to his most important business associates. A haughty, heavily jeweled socialite named Jessica approached them with a fake, condescending smile, attempting to embarrass Hannah by loudly asking which prominent, wealthy family she belonged to. Hannah smiled warmly, completely unbothered, and proudly declared that she came from a long line of hard-working bakers and cleaners, causing Jessica to sputter in sheer, absolute disbelief. When Jessica tried to insult her further, Hannah delivered a sharp, witty retort about the emptiness of wearing expensive jewels while lacking basic human decency, leaving the snobbish woman completely speechless and humiliated. Edward looked at Hannah with profound awe, realizing once again that her fierce independence and unwavering self-worth were his absolute favorite things about her. As the evening progressed toward midnight, Edward led her away from the crowded ballroom and out onto the quiet, expansive terrace overlooking the glowing, magical skyline of the city. Under the explosive, vibrant colors of the early fireworks illuminating the dark sky, Edward pulled her close, confessing that she was the absolute best thing that had ever happened to his predictable life. Hannah smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck, and they shared a deep, passionate kiss, letting the loud noise of the celebrating city fade into a beautiful, quiet background. Their perfect, romantic moment was harshly interrupted by a slow, sarcastic clap coming from the shadows of the terrace, revealing Victoria Anderson standing there in a striking crimson dress. "How incredibly touching," Victoria sneered, stepping into the light, before turning her venomous gaze to Hannah and accusing her of orchestrating a masterful plan to steal Edward's massive fortune. "You are nothing but a calculating opportunist," Victoria spat, claiming that Hannah was only interested in securing a luxurious lifestyle and would abandon Edward the moment his bank accounts ran dry. Hannah turned to Edward, fully expecting him to immediately defend her honor, but for a tiny fraction of a second, the billionaire hesitated, a brief shadow of doubt crossing his expressive face. That split second of hesitation was all it took to completely shatter Hannah's fragile trust, breaking her heart into a million irreparable pieces right there on the cold terrace. "You actually believe her," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling with profound disappointment, realizing that deep down, Edward still feared that people only wanted him for his immense wealth. Without waiting for his frantic apologies, she turned and fled the terrace, running through the crowded ballroom and out into the freezing winter night, leaving Edward standing completely paralyzed by his own foolish insecurities. 3 miserable days later, Hannah attended a modest community block party in her neighborhood, trying desperately to distract herself with cheerful music, laughing children, and the comforting presence of her kind neighbor, Mrs. Lucy. To her absolute shock, Edward suddenly appeared at the community gathering, dressed in simple denim jeans and a plain shirt, looking completely out of place but determined to win her back. Instead of making a grand, arrogant scene, he quietly rolled up his sleeves and walked straight to the volunteer kitchen, taking over the massive pile of dirty dishes from a quirky teenage volunteer named Toby. For hours, Edward scrubbed pots and pans, served food to the elderly, and laughed with the neighborhood children, proving to Hannah through sheer, humble effort that he was willing to put in the hard work. Mrs. Lucy nudged Hannah gently, pointing out that a wealthy man who was willing to ruin his expensive shoes and wash dishes for a community party was a man truly worth keeping. Hannah finally approached him at the sink, handing him a dry towel, asking him exactly what he thought he was trying to prove by doing manual labor in her neighborhood. "I am proving that I belong wherever you are," Edward answered sincerely, apologizing profusely for his foolish hesitation on the terrace, explaining it was his own deep insecurity, not a lack of faith in her pure heart. Hannah looked into his earnest eyes, seeing the genuine remorse and unwavering love shining through, and finally let go of her lingering anger, pulling him into a forgiving, tender embrace. Their joyful reconciliation was suddenly cut short when Edward's phone rang with catastrophic news from Gregory. A massive leak of highly confidential documents had just occurred, threatening to destroy their company's biggest merger. The corporate boardroom was in a state of absolute, unprecedented chaos when Edward finally arrived, with frantic executives shouting over one another and disastrous financial projections flashing brightly on the large screens. Graham Clark sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face thunderous with rage, immediately blaming Edward's recent distractions for the catastrophic security breach that threatened to ruin their legacy. Instead of backing down like he usually did, Edward stood incredibly tall, facing his intimidating father with a fierce, unwavering determination that instantly silenced the entire panicked room. "We are not going to hide or lie our way out of this crisis," Edward declared firmly, insisting that they would solve the massive problem with absolute, unprecedented transparency, regardless of the temporary financial cost. Just as Graham was about to explode with anger at his son's defiance, the heavy boardroom doors swung open, and Hannah confidently walked in, carrying a large cardboard box filled with her homemade pastries. She completely ignored the bewildered stares of the high-powered executives, setting the box down and cheerfully announcing that nobody could possibly solve a corporate crisis on an empty stomach. After handing out the treats, she listened intently to the frantic explanation of the leaked documents, quickly formulating a brilliant, daring plan that left the entire room staring at her in absolute awe. Hannah suggested that since the opposing company had lost all trust, they needed to publicly expose the real traitor in the upcoming joint board meeting, and she knew exactly how to execute the trap perfectly. During the incredibly tense, high-stakes joint meeting later that afternoon, Victoria Anderson sat smugly with the opposing executives, completely unaware of the massive trap that had been carefully set for her. Hannah suddenly entered the room, wearing a sharp, borrowed business suit and fake reading glasses, loudly introducing herself as an independent external auditor, hired to investigate the severe security breach. Playing her role flawlessly, Hannah projected undeniable digital evidence onto the massive screen, revealing a series of hidden emails and encrypted phone records that definitively traced the leaked documents directly back to Victoria. The entire room erupted in shocked gasps as the undeniable proof was laid bare, showing that Victoria had maliciously sabotaged the merger out of pure vindictive spite toward Edward. Caught completely red-handed, and unable to deny the overwhelming digital evidence, Victoria lost her composed demeanor entirely, screaming furiously at Edward and Hannah as the security guards firmly grabbed her arms. Graham Clark stood up slowly, a rare look of genuine respect crossing his stern face as he officially terminated Victoria's employment and ordered her to be escorted out of the building immediately. The executives from the opposing company, deeply impressed by Edward's commitment to radical transparency and Hannah's brilliant execution, immediately agreed to resume the massive merger negotiations, saving the corporate empire. As the boardroom slowly cleared out, Graham approached Hannah, offering a stiff but sincere nod of profound gratitude, finally acknowledging that she was far more than just a simple cleaning lady. The very next morning, Hannah received an unexpected, life-changing phone call from a prominent local investment firm that had heard the wild rumors about her daring, brilliant performance at the corporate meeting. The firm, incredibly impressed by her sheer boldness, intelligence, and sudden positive public profile, offered to provide the full financial capital needed to open her long-awaited dream cafe in her neighborhood. Overwhelmed with absolute joy and disbelief, Hannah excitedly shared the incredible news with Edward, who hugged her tightly, refusing to take any credit and insisting that she had earned this massive opportunity all on her own. Over the next several months, Hannah poured her entire heart and soul into renovating an abandoned corner store in Astoria, transforming it into the warm, welcoming community hub she had always envisioned. 1 year later, on a snowy Christmas Eve, the Sweet Home Cafe officially opened its doors. Filled with the delightful aroma of fresh coffee, sweet cinnamon cakes, and rich chocolate brownies. The cozy space was bustling with life, packed with joyous neighbors, including the ever-supportive Mrs. Lucy, and Toby, the quirky teenager who Hannah had happily hired as her very first official barista. Hannah stood behind the wooden counter, wearing her signature floral apron, beaming with immense pride as she served warm drinks and watched the vibrant community come together in the beautiful space she created. Just as the festive evening reached its peak, the front door jingled merrily, and Edward walked in, wearing a sharp winter coat and holding a perfect, uncrushed bouquet of beautiful white daisies. He walked straight toward her, completely ignoring the crowded room, his eyes shining with a deep, profound love that made Hannah's heart skip several joyful beats in her chest. Edward took her hands, dropping slowly to one knee right in the middle of the bustling cafe, causing the entire room to fall into a hushed, incredibly expectant silence. He spoke beautifully about how she had rescued him from a cold, empty life, teaching him the true value of human connection, before finally asking her to spend the rest of her life with him. With tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face, Hannah shouted a resounding yes, pulling him up for a passionate kiss as the entire cafe erupted into deafening, joyous applause. As the entire room erupted into joyous applause, it became beautifully clear that true wealth is never found in solitary penthouses or cold corporate empires. Life's most profound treasures are often hidden in the simplest of moments, disguised as a shared cup of coffee or a quiet word of comfort. We spend our youth chasing grand achievements and accumulating things we cannot take with us, forgetting that at the end of the road, the only empire that matters is the one built within the hearts of others. To let pride isolate us is the greatest poverty, while opening our doors to the unexpected kindness of strangers is the highest form of bravery. It takes a lifetime for many to understand that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the very bridge that connects our isolated islands. When we strip away the titles, the bank accounts, and the tailored suits, we are all just souls searching for a place to belong. True home is never a physical address. It is found entirely in the eyes of the people who make the deafening silence disappear and fill our fleeting days with enduring warmth.